Welcome to the Bellevue Brief, a podcast from the team at Bellevue Law, providing insights into topical workplace law and commercial disputes issues. I'm Anjali Malik, an associate at Bellevue Law, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Annie Robson, one of our senior consultants. We're diving into a topic that's gained momentum in legal and corporate circles: neurodiversity in the workplace.
So it's a subject that's close to many people's hearts. And I think I've certainly seen with clients I'm advising that we've seen a significant rise post-COVID in people being much more aware of neurodivergency, both for employers and for employees. And you might wonder why, I guess, but I think that's probably because during COVID, people had a bit more time to reflect, maybe a bit more time to research, and might wonder why things weren't going so well at work or something like that. So there have been a huge rise in people having a diagnosis as a neurodivergent, but there's also, I think, a lot more awareness of it now. And I think the positive of this, because it's a sort of scary thing to embrace from both an employer and employee perspective, but the positive is that having people that are neurodivergent in a workplace can add real value. So let's just have a think about what we mean when we say neurodivergence. I think really what we're going to be talking about today are the most common sorts of neurodivergence. And those are autism, ADHD, ADD, dyslexia. But the actual neurodivergent umbrella is much wider than that. And it can cover things like colour blindness, it can cover epilepsy and Tourette's. And all it really means is where your mind might work a little bit differently to what we might call something that's normal, although what really is normal? I mean, that's the key.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think we should start with some numbers on that. So among neurodivergent professionals surveyed in 2023, 31% were diagnosed as adults and only 26% were diagnosed during their childhood. And 15% are currently undergoing diagnosis and only 28% now plan to seek a diagnosis soon. So these stats are a really good reminder that neurodivergence isn't always immediately visible. And it's crucial that workplaces are prepared to support individuals at any point in their diagnostic journey. So employees also don't need to share a formal diagnosis at the start to start the conversation about their needs. And in fact, simply sharing their experience is enough to put the employer on notice. And given the significant delays in accessing a diagnosis, often I think we'll all know that sometimes it's years with the NHS and up to 1 year privately in some areas, it's important that that support doesn't hinge on any sort of formal paperwork.
So we talked about people being more aware of it. And I think, the figures that Anjali's just shared show a big, big shift. A statistic from last year suggested that 20% of the UK workforce were actually neurodivergent, which is, really significant. And yet the other side of that showed us that only 21% of businesses had really got anything in place to support neurodivergent employees, and particularly even at the recruitment stage. Only 21% made any allowances during a recruitment process for neurodivergency. That means that 80% will not make any accommodation.
Of course, and it doesn't stop there. So in my experience, it suggests that many workplaces are only just starting the journey into how best to support and gain benefits from neurodiversity within the workplace. And the statistics do show that 83% of neurodivergent employees feel anxious about disclosing their neurodiversity at work. And 59% say they don't feel adequately supported after disclosing it to their employer.
And I think it's fair to say a lot of the employers that I'm speaking to are still nervous. They see it as an avalanche of changes that are going to have to be made. So one of the things we're going to try and do today is to emphasise that actually let's turn it over, let's turn it on its side, and let's look at it from the other perspective. Let's look at it as how do we get the positives and how does that make a difference to you as a business? So there is still a stigma, I think, for people saying that they're neurodivergent. And I think the other thing that we've established during a bit of research that we've been doing is that it tends to show itself in females differently to men. So if we look at something, if we look at men, for example, they tend to be diagnosed earlier and they might be picked up quite early on in school and have had support for a number of years. You know, they might be seen when they're 4 or 5 years old as being a bit noisy or a bit difficult to control. They might get that support early on. So by the time they're in the workplace, they're more comfortable in their own skin. Women tend to be very good at masking and mimicking. And they learn that. That's a natural trait for a lot of women. So they may, when they're at school, have some difficulties, but they may mimic or mask in order to cover up those difficulties.
Yeah, so as Annie said, the story for women is often very different to that of men. So many neurodivergent women are diagnosed much later than what men are, and sometimes not even until adulthood, even despite suffering with it during their childhood with no help. So because they've obviously masked those traits from an early age, and they might appear to be socially fluent or emotionally attuned, but underneath it all, they're navigating huge sensory overload, anxiety, and exhaustion. The pressure to conform to gender expectations, to be polite and flexible and emotionally available, can make that masking that Annie's just talked about even more intense. But of course, that masking comes at a cost. It will lead to burnout, misdiagnosis, and a deep sense of isolation, not only in the workplace but also at home, in society, just generally. And neurodivergent women are often told that they're too much, too sensitive, too loud, but when in fact they're managing an invisible load every day. And I think Annie and I were talking about how often men in the workplace who are neurodivergent can be seen as quirky or brilliant, but it's just a different narrative for each gender sometimes.
So one thing that we're often asked about at Bellevue is what are the expectations on both the employer and employee side from a legal perspective? So neurodivergence can be a disability under the Equality Act, and it will often qualify. So the definition under the Equality Act is something that has a substantial and long-term impact on normal day-to-day activities. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, when we're advising, we know that substantial doesn't mean that big. So if it's something that impacts you every day in the way that you do something, that would qualify as substantial. It doesn't have to be super huge. Long term is anything that's going to last for 12 months or longer. And obviously, if you are neurodivergent, it's going to last for more than 12 months. So a lot of times people will be able to show that this could qualify as a disability. And therefore, the workplace has to be alive to that. And there are various types of claims that we might see more often. There is a direct discrimination claim. That's where somebody is treating somebody less favourably because of their protected characteristic. So here, because of their neurodivergency. And sort of examples of that might be, your line manager setting unrealistic expectations. It might be colleagues taking the mickey out of you at work, or forcing you into social situations where you feel very uncomfortable. Another type of discrimination that's a really key one, I think, in this area is indirect discrimination. And that's where there's a policy, a procedure or practice in a workplace that indirectly treats that person with the protected characteristic less favourably. So things that I've seen actually very recently are there being no policies in place for somebody that's neurodivergent, and that person therefore doesn't know where to turn. I think it's a really key point, and I've got a case at the moment where an employer has thought it's fine actually not to have a policy, and it's new ground. You know, a lot of employers don't yet have things in place, but the key thing is that for an employee, that's a really important thing. It's a roadmap, sets out expectations, and it gives them, a route to follow, and that can be really helpful. Other things are things around training, if you're not trained, then there are cases, just very recent one actually, where there was no proper training in place, and somebody who was autistic really struggled. Their line manager was not trained in any way about how to deal with them, and or how to interact with them, and that employer was found to be liable. So I think a lack of training can be a real problem and a real cause for concern.
And when it comes to direct discrimination, the key point we want to emphasise here is that the liability hinges on the impact on the individual who's actually raising the concern. And it's less about whether the employer believes their actions were reasonable. So employers should also be aware that they are judged based on what they ought to have known rather than what they can prove later or that they were explicitly told by that employee. So in terms of embracing neurodiversity, I think Annie and I were talking about this previously and saying that we think, employers always worried about getting things wrong. Are they going to get it right? What do we do? What's the right thing to say? Am I going to... They kind of tread on eggshells around it. But we want to just emphasise the point that neurodiversity isn't a problem that needs to be solved. It's actually a strength that should be embraced by the workplace, by your employer, by your colleagues. Neurodivergent individuals bring unique perspectives, skills, and ways of thinking that can drive innovation, creativity, and resilience in the workplace. So I think we were just talking about how the advantages are countless when you think about them, and organisations create environments where neurodivergent talent can thrive, and everyone benefits in the end.
I mean, we've all come across people that we know are neurodivergent, or we might think they are. But if we look at some really successful people out there, Steve Jobs.
Elon Musk?
Yeah, Elon Musk. He's been very open about the fact he's got Asperger's. And there are some real high flyers who are neurodivergent. So, imagine a situation where employers are too scared to do something about it.
Absolutely.
They're missing out on a lot of opportunities. They're missing out on creative thinking. Someone that's autistic might have fabulous ability to recognise patterns, a huge attention to detail. The creative thinking will create alternative perspectives. And imagine those qualities in a team. You want a mix of people in a team because everybody can add some value. So it's really important that employers be a bit brave and stop being so nervous about it, because it can improve retention, it can help well-being in the workplace, and can really be a positive for team dynamics. And also, one of the things we were looking at is there are certain industries where there are huge talent gaps. One of them is the IT industry. And I think a couple of years ago, there were about 900,000 vacancies for skilled IT workers. And technology is a prime area for people to excel as a neurodivergent.
And we were also looking at the JP Morgan Autism at Work initiative. You might be familiar with it. And that found that employees with autism outperformed their neurotypical peers in certain roles. And there was a whopping 140% increase in productivity gains for those people. And those roles often included, like Annie was talking about, pattern recognition, attention to detail, and sustained focus. So areas where neurodivergent individuals can excel. And similarly, another study by Hewlett Packard, they showed that neurodivergent teams were 30% more productive than their neurotypical counterparts. And the research highlighted that how cognitive diversity leads to better problem solving, more creative approaches, and stronger team dynamics, especially when they're supported by those inclusive practices that Annie was just talking about. But these findings, they're not isolated. They're across industries, companies, and they're discovering that when neurodivergent employees are given the right environment and given the right support, they don't just meet expectations, they exceed them, they're excelling. So it's all about giving them the support that they need to see how well they can do within the workplace.
So we're going to look at some practical steps now, because we've talked a lot about what the positives are. So Anjali, what would you talk about in terms of recruitment and practical steps that we think might make a difference?
So, in terms of recruitment, what could employers use? So, many neurodivergent thinkers won't perform well in timed tests. It's as we've seen in lots of different grad recruitment schemes or various the first stage of various assessment centres, for example, it's always timed. There's always a deadline. So you could maybe think about having those things, extending the deadline, giving them overnight, giving them 2 days, but not making it as short of a deadline for certain things and not making it timed. Another thing that we would advise employers to do is to use clear, inclusive job descriptions. So avoid any vague or overly social criteria and focus on skills and outcomes. And I'm sure lots of people will find that quite reassuring to see. Another thing you could be doing is offer flexible application formats. So allow alternatives like video, written, or portfolio submissions rather than having someone in face to face, which could be quite daunting for some people. And also be transparent about the recruitment process from the get go. Share the interview formats, share the timelines, and share your expectations up front rather than waiting down the line to reduce people's anxiety. And a final thing for me on this point would be to provide interview accommodation. So offer extra time, like I was saying before, offer these alternative formats. And some people might even prefer to have the written questions in advance of going into the interview to give them a bit of time to prepare.
And we're not saying you have to do that for every role,
No.
because there'll be some roles that won't work for. But what we're saying is there shouldn't be one type of interview process for every type of role, because if you do that, you're going to miss some of those better candidates.
Absolutely.
And we talked about interviewing, we talked about recruitment. The key thing, obviously, as well, is going to be they're working with you. How do you manage that workforce? And this is another area of a possible legal claim, which is the legal requirement, if someone has a bit of disability, to make legal reasonable adjustments in the workplace. And again, this is a big area. Employers are nervous about it. That's understandable. I think the key thing from a reasonable adjustments perspective is employers aren't expected to move the earth. They're expected to make reasonable changes to allow that employee to do the role that they've been employed to do. So let's look at some examples of that. They may be things like, allowing for headphones. They may be working with an employee on rearranging their day better. So, for example, if you're autistic, it's really important to have quiet times, quiet air, and also quiet spaces in which to work. That doesn't mean that you should say, well, I've always got to work at home, but your employer should be more understanding of the need and the impact of your productivity on your productivity if you have that quiet time and quiet space. So that's really important. Other things for the workforce. I'm saying to a number of employer clients at the moment that one first step is to do a survey. Find out, be brave enough to find out how people really feel. Because what you're trying to do is to create a more of a dialogue, more of an open space, so people feel they can tell you if they're struggling, and that you can then get the best out of the workplace and those team environments. I'm a big believer in having a policy. We're going to be putting together a policy that we can share, and you need to adapt it, obviously, as an employer to suit your workplace. But I think it's an essential roadmap in a situation like this. I also think one key area that everybody's always so nervous about is feedback. That whole idea of how do I give feedback? Yeah. If you create an environment that's far more open, and people feel more comfortable about saying something's not working, then you're not giving feedback twice a year. The whole idea of a performance review should become less scary, because it won't be a surprise. And a key thing, of course, in feedback is that training that I mentioned earlier, making sure that both line managers and employees understand about neurodivergency and understand how to manage it in the workplace from both perspectives.
Absolutely. And we were talking just before this about there was a study that employees who were neurodivergent who had those enhancements, had those things that would adjust, those noise cancelling headphones, anything they might need, they were 2 to 3 times more productive when they had those extra things that would help them in the workplace, which is amazing. It's just another incentive to help those people and get the best out of your workforce, like Annie was just saying.
I also think actually one area that people sort of skirt over is, and it's an easy thing to implement, is a buddy system.
Yes, yeah.
So talks about the more formal part of it with a performance review, but actually having a buddy system again helps with that open dialogue.
Speaking, yeah.
And it not every conversation isn't a formal conversation.
Absolutely. Sometimes you get the best out of people when they're feeling more informal. You can hear how they actually truly feel. But Annie, if we had any neurodivergent people that are listening to the podcast now, what would you advise them, and what do they need to know about how to not only survive but how to thrive in the workplace?
So these are interesting times. It is a big thing now, and one thing I would say to people is don't advocate for your strengths. Gone are the times when you had to pretend that you were going to be somebody else. Be proud of the way that you're doing things, but don't be afraid to ask that things are done differently. So, for example, you might be dyslexic. If you're dyslexic, sometimes it's really hard when someone's talking to you and gives you instructions because you can't actually assimilate it all. Ask for it to be in writing. And if you're the employee, you might think, oh gosh, I'm going to have to write everything down. No, you don't. All you do is you get a system going where the employee feels comfortable enough to say, great, thanks for giving me that job or that task to do. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to jot you down an email so I've make sure I've got it right. I've understood what you've asked me to do and just confirm it. That's fine.
Yeah, yes or no.
But then everybody moves forward more easily. So really, it's about two things. It's about much more open communication, and it's about creating an environment where there is that level of comfort about speaking up.
Absolutely. So that's all for today. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation on neurodiversity in the workplace. And as we've heard today, supporting neurodivergent professionals isn't just about accommodations. It's about rethinking how we define talent, inclusion and success.
So whether you're an employer, an employee, really the key takeaway for us is this is a new time. This is a time when inclusion is key, and everybody needs to start listening. So it's a scary step, but it's a positive step to take.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you.